let me start. So I'll say a little bit about myself, but I'm just have such this gratitude and appreciation for being invited tonight. And I'm going to talk about something that's a little bit heavy, but before I get into the heaviness, I want to introduce myself, because how I came to do what I do, it's really out of the ordinary. And without going into a whole long story, I'll just give you a real, sort of essential few minutes. So I had, when I was 24 in 1981, I had a full-blown spiritual awakening, and it almost killed me. And the awakening got catalyzed out of, so I'm an only child, and without going into the story, my father was a really sick guy, a really kind of a bad guy. And I was the recipient of him we all act out our unhealed abuse, so he acted it out on me, and it created enormous suffering for me. And that's why I went inwards. And just the only thing I could figure out that was helpful was to just assume the position of being the witness to what was happening inside of my mind. And that was the only thing I found out of all my, because I was really smart in school, and I quickly figured out I couldn't figure my way out of my suffering. So I began just to watch, and slowly, it was helping, but it was helping like 1 or 2%. The suffering was overwhelming to the point, so I was a very highly accomplished kid, a straight A student, to the point where I couldn't live my life. The abuse was so, and it was all just this emotional, psychological abuse, not physical. But at a certain point, once I began to individuate and separate from the family, that's when it really blossomed. So that's when I went inwards. And then after almost 2 years of doing that, hours and hours and hours a day, I had this full-blown awakening. I got hit by a bolt of lightning inside of my brain, not from the sky. And I went into a completely extreme state where I was beginning to have the recognition, oh my God, we're having a dream. We're having a collectively shared dream. And I was so excited and enthusiastic at, wanting to express to everybody what good news this was. That's what got me in trouble. And so I'll just tell you the first little quick story. So within 24 hours, I get brought to my first psychiatric hospital. And they bring me in, and I'm having a full-blown spiritual awakening. And they bring me in, it's nighttime, it's Highland Hospital, Oakland, California. They brought me over I was in San Francisco at that point. They brought me by ambulance into this hospital. And what happened next, it totally changed my life, and it helped me to get through the next couple of years. And what happened next, and I wasn't even planning on sharing this, but it just is coming through. I get brought into the psychiatric ward. It's after dinner. It's the lounge where the psychiatric patients are. This is bringing up a lot of emotion. And basically, I walk into the lounge. I'm being admitted. And I see this woman, this older woman, and she can't see. Her eyes are blind. Her eyes are opaque. There's no radiance, just like a blind person. And without even thinking about what to do, I just went right up to her, and it was like I was given a script with these lines, and I was just staring in her eyes, getting closer and closer as I was saying the following words. All you have to do to see is open your eyes and look. I kept on repeating those words, kept on getting closer to her. The whole thing took about a minute, and she regained her sight. At that point, like it was choreographed, they came and they gave me a pill to swallow, and I'm assuming it wasn't just like a vitamin C or something. And then they strapped me up on a bed, because from their point of view, I'm having a psychotic break. And so just, I didn't exactly get a good night's sleep that night, let's put it that way. And then they unstrapped me the next morning. They put me in a room. I'm sitting at a chair with a desk, and the only other person in the room is this ex-blind woman. Wow. And she's just sort of smiling at me, not saying a word, and all of a sudden my heart chakra just blossomed. And I understood, oh, I get it. Her eyes were physically fine, but she was hysterically blind, and somehow I was sent by central casting, and was given these lines, and I said it like I had been preparing for lifetimes. And she was at the point of being, she was ready to heal her blindness, and I got dreamed up to pick up that role. Now that, I just want to point out, I'm going to get back to that little vignette because that's really at the core of my whole work, what actually the deeper process that played out. And then she says to me, the only word she ever said to me, she goes, "Are you going to answer the phone call from," and she mentions my father's name. And then within like seconds, the nurse comes in the room and says, "Paul, your father's on the phone." Because my parents had just gotten word that I had a psychotic break. And so to make a long story short, I get out of that hospital after 3 days because the doctor in charge of me, he reflected back, I had to prove to him that I wasn't totally crazy, or he was going to keep me there for a long time. And so I remember I just completely I was in a super expansive state, not caring I was in the hospital. I forced myself down and I began talking about my neuroses and my problems, and he says, "Fine, you're normal, you can go." That's how you get out of the psychiatric hospital. And actually I got together with him the next, like 1 week later, we had lunch, and he told me the fact that I could do that I could be fluid between my identities, that's what showed him that I wasn't crazy. And I told him about the blind woman, and he got incredibly uncomfortable and said, "Oh, patient confidentiality, we can't really talk about that." To just tie up the loose end of the story, and then I'm going to get into my subject matter tonight. So when I got out of that hospital, when you have an experience like that, there's no doubt that you're having some form of spiritual experience. I mean, it just couldn't have been more obvious. And that was only one. Over the next number of months, or however many months it was, there were like just so many of these experiences that make that one look sort of minor. But that's the one I've been given permission to talk about, because if you think about it, with that blind woman, it wasn't this miracle, even though it has a flavor of it. It was just an incredibly highly improbable event that somebody just happened to be in the right place at the right time and just intuitively know what to do and say to help somebody to heal. I mean, that's possible. It's not impossible. Stuff began happening that from then on that was impossible, or at least it was impossible from what I had been taught in my growing up to what was possible in this realm. So I knew something was happening. All of my friends at that point, they were all consensus reality, and they'd signed on. Oh, you're just, at that point, the DSM-3 had just come out the year before with the chemical imbalance was the new big discovery. So every doctor was telling me, "Oh, you have this chemical imbalance," because over that next maybe 1.5 years, I was hospitalized maybe 3, 4, 5 other times, I don't quite remember. And every single doctor was saying, "Oh, you're manic depressive, bipolar," I think they didn't call it bipolar then, just manic depressive. "You have this chemical imbalance. We guarantee you have this illness. You're going to have to be on medication until your dying breath. And if you don't stay on the medication, you'll immediately have a psychotic break." They were like telling me this. And, I should just meta-communicate for a second. I haven't been on, I quickly took myself off the meds. I haven't been on meds for, 35, 37 years, so like a long, long time without any episodes, which according to them is impossible if you're bipolar. But what I did when I got out of that hospital, so I was in an interesting, I was like having a foot in both worlds, because I knew something had happened. And all of my friends and relatives were like, no, Paul, you're in denial of your illness. You have this mental illness. So I figured I had to find somebody to talk to about what happened. And I found out there was this Buddhist monk from Southeast Asia who I went to, within a few days of getting out of that hospital, I went to tell him what happened with that blind woman. Because when something like that happens, you're dying to connect with someone who understands. And he said to me, "You're in luck. The greatest Buddhist master of all of Burma," at that point he was 85, "has just arrived into the Bay Area to buy land to start the first Theravada monastery," which is what he did. So I went to see him, and in a way I don't understand, we made an incredible connection. Like every time I would come, he had a whole entourage of monks from Burma, really hard to get to see. They would immediately bring me in, and it was, somehow we had a real connection. But then over that next 18 months, like I said, I was continuing to have this awakening, but I wasn't in an ashram or a monastery because they were, I wasn't at that, they hadn't bought the monastery yet. So I was just a free agent out in the world, and I hadn't integrated enough to understand how to navigate consensus reality in a way that wouldn't freak people out. So that's why basically, I got hospitalized a number of times, like 3-4 times. I figured that out after the last hospitalization in '82. And then it took me over a decade of going to therapy and connecting with my dreams and studying, and making art and, going into shamanism or studying alchemy, just anything that, because in my world there were very few people who really understood who I could talk to about what happened. My entire family, they bought in, because in their world, my parents' world, a psychiatrist is they're an authority figure who has wisdom, which isn't quite my perspective, but and so they bought into that, and when they both passed away, convinced that that I'm just in denial of my mental illness, and so there's a tragic aspect to it. And then all of the rest of the relatives, once my last parent died in 2002, I've been excommunicated. I haven't had any contact. They just think, oh yeah, we have this relative out in the West Coast who's in denial of his mental illness, blah, blah, blah. And it's a trip, and I have to live with that. That's incredibly painful. But why I'm sharing this is, so for that, over a decade after that last hospitalization, I did incredible inner work trying to figure out what is going on. And then I found I had to move back to the East Coast. I found, some other of my teachers, these great Tibetan lamas. Some of you might know them. I bring them to Portland. And I began doing real serious Tibetan Buddhist practice. And then at a certain point, fast forward, I moved to Portland like almost 30 years ago. And a few years in, after being here, I had the realization, wow, I feel like I've integrated sufficiently, not, I'm a work in progress like all of us, but that I have something to offer. And that's when I began teaching or writing or opening up my private practice. And one of the things that I have to offer, and it's what played out in my family system, was, wow, when there's evil, and I'm not saying in any way that my father was evil. That would be to conflate an archetypal energy with a person. No, but I didn't, being a kid, you don't really understand this. My father had unwittingly had in a way, offered himself to be an instrument for darker forces to come through. And those darker forces configured the whole environment to the point where whenever, as the kid who was sensitive and was pointing out these darker forces, right when they were going to be exposed, I couldn't believe it. Like synchronistically, the whole field would configure and to protect the abuser, to protect my father. And then I realized, oh my God, the same thing was happening with psychiatry. It was like the same darker energy that had come through my father had come through psychiatry. And the thing which helped me, so I was really mad at myself for like, oh my God, I really blew it. That's being kind of an understatement. As far as, wow, why did I have to be hospitalized? That really seemingly just shut down my awakening. But then at a certain point, I realized, no, that was part of it. That was like, in a sense, the going into the underworld, the descent into the darkness of the unconscious. So as I was more and more integrating, I was more and more like seeing, oh wow, there's this force that's in the universe, and that's actually in the origin of the forces in our psyche. And it plays out both inside of each one of us, it plays out between us via the relationships we have, and it's playing out in the greater body politic in the world. Mm-hmm. So in case people haven't noticed, there's a collective psychosis going on. And, so many of us, like I just remember running into a friend a few years ago, and I hadn't seen him for a while. He asked me what I was doing. This was like, 10, 15 years ago. And I said, oh, I'm writing a book about the collective psychosis. And he goes, oh, what collective psychosis? Like, what makes you think there's a collective psychosis? Yeah. And I wanted to ask him, well, what makes you think there's not? But because we have an image that, oh, if there's a collective psychosis, people are going to be running around naked, screaming, or whatever. But I would point out that we're incredibly in the midst of one, and like a fish in water, a lot of people aren't aware of it. And so when George W. Bush became president, I was so freaked out. I wrote a book about it, and I was pointing out, oh, he's like dreamed up. He's a dream character embodying our own insanity. That we dreamed him up, and he's not separate from us. But I didn't know the word. Then I found this indigenous, or maybe I had like a paragraph about Native American people have a word, the Wetiko psychosis. It's a collective psychosis. And I came across it, and I began studying it, and I realized, oh my God, this maps on exactly to what I've been tracking. And so that's when I wrote my book about Wetiko. That's, I think, upstairs. And it's a profound idea. It's like, sometimes they'll talk about, you have an idea that's like this saving idea. Like the idea of Wetiko is a saving idea, in the sense that it actually, so what it is, it's a psychospiritual disease of the soul that operates through the blindness of our unconscious. And to the extent we're unaware of it, we then unwittingly become an instrument through which it incarnates. And it works through the projective tendencies of the mind. We're all projecting. You know, this world, this waking dream, it's like an ink blot, just like a night dream is an ink blot. And when we project on an ink blot, you know, instantaneously, not in 1 second, but in no time at all, the ink blot has no choice but to shapeshift and reflect back our projection. And if we're not awake to that process, we then get entranced thinking that what we're seeing is objective, is separate from us, which we then react to as a seeming subject. And we become conditioned via our own projection onto the ink blot. And basically what I'm talking about is we hypnotize ourselves, we entrance ourselves. What I'm basically saying is that we, each of us, have this incredible, we are these like creative sort of like geniuses, but our genius has been turned against us in a way that's killing us. And I want to say too, so I have another book up there that I just wrote on quantum physics. And the thing about Wetiko, it's a quantum phenomena. And so I'll talk a small bit about quantum physics tonight because it helps to really contextualize Wetiko. And I even forget, I think I'm coming back again in June or something to talk about quantum physics. Because keep in mind, quantum physics is the greatest discovery ever in all of history in the realm of science. That there's no doubt about. What everybody doesn't understand is, what does it mean? And not that I understand that, but I have a particular sort of this view of holding quantum physics that actually is the medicine for the disease that's ailing our species, which is Wetiko. And keep in mind, Wetiko, it's just a native term. Every spiritual, and actually I'm almost finished with my next book, and it's on Wetiko because it's such a profound concept. And what the book is, it's pointing out that every spiritual tradition in the history of this planet, including unbelievable genius, creative scientists and artists, they're all pointing at Wetiko, but they call it by different names. So that's what the book is about, is really, showing that and articulating how Islam and Christianity and Buddhism and Philip K. Dick and Colin Wilson, and they're all pointing creatively at Wetiko. Because Wetiko, as long as it operates and it's not recognized, it has incredible power. And it can destroy us, and it is destroying us. It's at the bottom of what's playing out in the world. And I just want to pause for a second. Some people think, oh, well, Paul's work is really like out there and really kind of this new agey, this woo-woo thing. Well, in essence, what I'm saying is that the essence of the insanity that's playing out in the world is to be found in the human psyche. And to me, that doesn't sound like such a stretch. That sounds like, what could be more obvious than that, So the thing about Wetiko, it's this form of being blind. It's a psychic blindness, but it's a particular form of blindness. That it's a blindness that actually thinks that it's sighted, And not only that, it thinks that it's more sighted than the people who actually are sighted. And it's contagious. So it operates through the blind spots of the unconscious. So we become entranced by our projections. And when we hold a particular point of view, we're going to draw evidence to confirm that point of view. And then other people who are holding that point of view, they get into alignment because then we're like reinforcing their perspective. So then, we're all colluding, the people who are under that particular spell, in being the instruments to propagate the collective psychosis. And one really good and very simple way of understanding what I'm talking about, say if you're actually in like this night dream, right? So just imagine, let's sort of try to evoke the imagination for a moment, and imagine you're in a night dream, and you're holding a viewpoint in the dream. Right, and then say for just an example, and first off, what is that night dream? What is a dream? It's a projection. It's this reflection of the mind. It's nothing other than the mind. When you're having a dream, you're inside of your psyche. And but if you all of a sudden change that viewpoint that you're holding as a dream character, as the dream ego, and you change your viewpoint, the whole dream has no choice but to spontaneously shapeshift and reflect back your change in viewpoint, because the dream is nothing other than your own psyche. So then it shapeshifts to reflect back your viewpoint, which serves as evidence. Oh, well, my viewpoint is correct, because look, now I have all the proof I need, which makes you even more entranced in your viewpoint, thinking you're just seeing objective reality. You're just passively just observing what's real. And the more entrenched you become in that viewpoint, the more the dream becomes fixed, giving you the evidence, confirming your viewpoint, ad infinitum, and you've put yourself under a spell by the power of your own dreaming, by the power of your own mind. And that's what we are doing as a species, okay? But if in that dream, if you have that recognition, wait a second, what I'm seeing out there is just, I'm actually dreaming. So if you have lucidity and you realize, oh my God, this is all just a reflection of my own mind, well, that's where it gets really interesting, because all of a sudden, instead of being conditioned by the forms of the dream, thinking they're objective, you actually, the whole way that you have, whatever, that you're having relationship to the dream changes, and you've actually connected with your creative power to create your experience. Because the thing that Wetiko does, going back to Wetiko, is that it has no creative agency at all, but it actually taps into your creative imagination so that it then, unwitting to you, it will then plug into your creative imagination in a way that feeds it and serves it. It's like a tapeworm when we have a tapeworm in our body, sure. And all of a sudden it'll secrete chemicals where we'll like, oh, I crave a particular food, and you think you're like, you're feeding yourself, but you're actually feeding the tapeworm, and it grows bigger and bigger. And all the while you're thinking you're acting on your own impulse, but you're actually acting on some sort of alien impulse. Now that tapeworm, it doesn't want to kill you too soon, because then it would suffer the inconvenience of having to find a new host. But it eventually kills you, and that's like Wetiko. Wetiko is like this. It's like a parasite of the mind. Virus is a perfect description. It's this virus of the mind that in and of itself doesn't even exist. It has no independent, intrinsic existence at all. So if people hear about Wetiko and they get all scared, going, oh, there's this virus of the mind and we should be scared of it. No. That viewpoint is itself Wetiko, because Wetiko feeds off of fear and polarization. So it has no existence whatsoever, and yet it can kill us. It can destroy our species. And what that's pointing at is the incredible, untapped, invisible creative power that we have to create our experience. Okay? And Wetiko, it literally taps into that, turns our creative genius to create our experience of ourselves and our experience of the world, and it turns it against us in a way that's killing us. And this is where quantum physics comes in, because when I say, so I'm just going to give a little teaser from my June quantum physics talk. When I say that Wetiko is a quantum phenomenon, what I mean is this. So in quantum physics, they've discovered some incredibly interesting things. On the one hand, they're trying to study, they try to study what's the nature of, say there's, of just the physical universe, but say they've discovered that how you observe the nature of light. If you observe light and ask certain questions and set up your experiments in a certain way, it'll manifest as a particle. But then if you observe it in a different way, it will manifest as a wave. So they're like wondering, oh, well, what is the nature of light? Is it a particle or is it a wave? And they've realized, well, it's encoded in light. It's both potentialities, wave and a particle. And how it manifests, it depends how we observe it. That's like Wetiko, because Wetiko is the source of the greatest evil that our species is playing out, both just everywhere in the greater body politic. And to the extent we're playing it out on ourselves through our addictions or habitual patterns or self-destructive habits. But encoded in Wetiko, it's actually helping us to wake up. And but if we don't have the recognition of what it's showing us, it's going to kill us, guaranteed. And so that's one of the ways that Wetiko is a quantum phenomenon. Like if Wetiko didn't exist, we would have to invent it. That's how important it is. And it's the greatest catalyst for the evolution of our species. And instead of I think with other bugs, you put an antibiotic and the bug mutates to have resistance to the antibiotic, Wetiko forces us to mutate. It's actually catalyzing our evolution. And so every spiritual tradition I've studied about this, they all say the same thing. They say there's nothing more important than understanding, whatever name they're calling Wetiko. Like in the Castaneda books, Don Juan, Carlos's teacher, says this is the topic of topics, or whatever name, it's a different name he calls it. Because if we don't, have the recognition of what it's showing us, it's going to kill us. There's no doubt about that. Now, another way that Wetiko is a quantum phenomena, so quantum physics basically has discovered that the universe, that classical physics, pre-quantum physics, was studying the objective world, and we were just passively observing, trying to understand what is the nature of this objective world. Quantum physics has empirically proven that there's no such thing, that the idea of an objective world is total nonsense. It doesn't exist. That the act of observing actually influences the universe that we're observing, that the observer, the observed, and the act of observation are interconnected parts of one quantum system. And what that means is mind-blowing, because what that means is that the act of observation is creative. We're creating our experience of ourselves and of the universe each and every moment via our act of observing, of interpreting the ink blot, of placing meaning on it. But what quantum physics is pointing out, or what it's discovered, is that, so there's no such thing as an objective universe. Well, that is very interesting, because once you really get that there's nothing out there that's objective, that's solid and separate, and keep in mind what I'm talking about, this is exactly what all the wisdom traditions, I do Tibetan Buddhist practice, and this is exactly the main fundamental, inside of Tibetan Buddhism, that, it's just the nature of everything is emptiness. There's no intrinsic, independent, substantial existence at all, separate from your own mind. And one very simple way of understanding that, you're in a dream, you don't realize the nature of your situation, so you think it's real, and you think whatever the environment is separate, objective, and all that. But then when you have lucidity and you have the recognition, oh wow, the forms don't exist on their own side, that they're actually an expression of how I'm observing them. That's the emptiness, and that's what quantum physics has basically discovered, that there's nothing objective. Well, just stay with that for a second. When there's nothing objective, there's no objective world, then what happened to the subject? We can't exist as a subject if there's no object to be in relationship to. So all of a sudden, quantum physics, when you really, and this is what the quantum physics book is about, when you really kind of hold it in a certain way, as far as, what does it mean? What is it revealing? It's actually reflecting our nature, in a way that if we've been identified with this reference point in space and time as this limited ego, that's the illusion that quantum physics will dissolve and will introduce us to, oh my God, we're actually creative agents beyond our wildest dreams. Okay, now interestingly, in that book I wrote about Bush's madness, and I didn't, I think I just had like a paragraph about Wetiko because I just heard about it. But the whole book was about Wetiko. I just called it a different name, and the name was Malignant Egophrenia. M-E disease. Me disease. It's a misidentification of who we think we are.
Wow.
If we think we exist in a certain way, as a reference point, like I was saying in space and time, as an isolated self, by the power of our dreaming, then, well, that's us as subject, reciprocally co-arising with our experience as ourselves as subject is the world as object, and then we've entranced ourselves. Then we've fallen asleep into duality, and we are just reacting to our own projections, similar to like when you have a kitten, and there's a mirror, and the kitten's looking in the mirror, and she sees her reflection, but she doesn't recognize it's her own energy, and she just reacts to the reflection, and the reflection just reflects that back, and it's an infinite feedback loop. That's us to the extent that we're asleep.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Okay? And so quantum physics is the medicine for Wetiko. And I talk about this in both because I talk about Wetiko in the quantum physics book, and I talk about, quantum physics, whatever. I talk about both of them in each of the books. But quantum physics, what it's showing us is the medicine, is the cure for Wetiko. And what I'm pointing out is that it's one thing for one person to have this realization, and of course it's so easy to forget. I mean, just think about it. You're in a dream, you have lucidity, oh wow, I'm, dreaming, this is amazing. And then if you're not careful, the next scene you're gonna be absorbed back in the dream. So the way I understand and the way I do my practice, my spiritual practice, is you really more and more just deepen and try to stabilize that lucidity, that realization of what I'm pointing out, of this being a dream and all that. And but that, if it's just one person doing that, well, it's going to help their life a lot. But so what? The point is, when you bring people together who are all turned on to that realization and understanding that, oh my God, we can actually, it's what I call the sacred power of dreaming. That when you're in a dream, so say if we're in a dream right now, and if I have lucidity, and if I have lucidity, what does that look like? What does that mean? Well, that means I would have the realization that all of you are like these dream characters of mine, and I'm a dream character of yours, that we're co-dreaming, right? But what if it wasn't just me? What if a second person had that lucidity? Or what if a 10th person had that lucidity? Or what if we all had that lucidity in this room and we came together and contemplated, oh my God, we're having a lucid dream right now. What are we recognizing? And I would suggest via the imagination that what we're actually having the recognition of is that this universe, that we're all dreaming it up. But we've been dreaming it up unconsciously. We haven't known. We have this unbelievable power. And, just to unfold that imagination, I find myself imagining when sufficient number of people come together in lucidity and have the realization, oh my God, we can conspire to co-inspire each other. That's a real conspiracy theory, but we can dream ourselves awake is what we can do, and that's evolutionary, and we discover that we actually are being cast in the role of participating in our own evolution, and that's what Wetiko is here to show us, because we have dreamed up, without getting into politics, whatever's happening in the greater body politic, we've dreamed up, just the horror of what's playing out in the world, the insanity of what's playing out in the world. Now, just one thing I want to point out, one of the things that really helped me when I got out of the last hospital, the work of Carl Jung. If I hadn't found his work, I don't know if I would have made it, because he went through his own shamanic descent. And once I found his work, and it's very synchronistic how I found it, I'm not going to go into it now, but I realized, oh my God, here's somebody who's finding the words for exactly what I've been experiencing, and hardly anybody, can speak this language. And he has a term, totalitarian psychosis. And because I've read, I've studied him for decades, and he has a number of terms, that sort of connote Wetiko that are equivalent, but totalitarian psychosis is one way he describes it, because he's pointing out that when we have Wetiko, we're actually disconnected from our power, from our true power, from our creative power, from our authority of being the authors of our lives, of being the dreamer of our waking dream. And because we're disassociated from that, we actually project it out, and somebody, typically the state, is very happy to take our creative power for us and to tell us what's true, And now the thing about Wetiko, it can't, so there's nothing to be afraid of. That's the thing, because like I was trying to say before, Wetiko feeds off of a field, or a culture of fear and polarization. And just think about the polarization that's happening in the body politic these days. We've never seen anything like it. So the thing about Wetiko, it can't steal our soul. It doesn't have the power to do that, but it can trick us into giving it away, And now also a thing about Wetiko, just like a vampire, because Wetiko, the vampire myth, that's like the epitome, the personification, the embodiment of Wetiko in action. In the sense that a vampire it's not this living thing. It can only seemingly be alive if it feeds off of a living entity, such as us. And a vampire, just in the whole mythology, is encoded so much about Wetiko. Because think about it, once the sun rises and there's light, the vampire, it has no power. Yeah, if we see Wetiko, once you see how once you have the recognition of how it operates, both out in the world and within our minds, then you take away its power. It has no power. And one of the ways it acts in our minds is through our reactions. So say all of a sudden, if somebody is embodying for a moment, so if I say, that person has Wetiko, and if I'm concretizing them as having Wetiko, well, guess what? Then I've fallen under the spell. Because I've fallen under the spell of otherness, of, thinking that they're separate from me. So Wetiko, it feeds off of, that whole sense of separate self. And, so there's so many threads I'm trying to weave in my mind. One thing I want to not forget is, so there are three ways of seeing Wetiko, because when you see it, you take away its power. Not only does it have no power at all, but then you become empowered. And the ways to see it, and they're all interconnected, they're all aspects of the same kind of insight. One is to have the recognition of the dream, that we're dreaming, of the dream-like nature of reality. Okay, and think about it, that was the experience I began having in 1981, which got me in deep trouble because I hadn't integrated how to express it in a way that wouldn't upset people. So one is seeing the dreamlike nature. Two is, in physics, they talk about the field. There's a non-local field that, in which we're all contained, that we're all instruments for, it pervades everything. And that's the primordial reality, is the non-local field. So it's like sort of being under a spell and snapping out of the spell, where all of a sudden, instead of being entranced by the particular forms, you actually see the deeper energy or the deeper patterning that's connecting and unfolding through all the individual forms. So that's the non-local field. That's number two. First is seeing the dreamlike nature. Two is seeing the non-local field. Three is snapping out of the imagination that we exist as separate selves and actually really seeing, oh wow, we're actually interconnected. We're interdependent. That I don't exist as this separate self, but I only exist, I'm like having a relationship with that person or those people or the whole universe, and they don't exist as separate selves because they exist only in relationship to other parts of the universe, which itself doesn't exist independently, intrinsically. It's like an interconnected, interdependent web. Mm-hmm. Okay? So when you're beginning to see that, and that's the vision of quantum physics, because quantum physics is pointing out that this universe is a seamless whole. There's no separation. The whole non-locality is, they have these subatomic particles and they'll put them at different ends of the universe and they'll change the spin on one, and instantaneously, faster than the speed of light, it seems to communicate to the other one that has, that changes with reference to the first one. The idea being that there is no, and it's not like information is being transferred over. No, it's instantaneous. It's like, so there's, and that's pointing out, I can go into it a lot, but I'll wait till June. That's pointing out, that we're all one piece. We're all, there's a sense of not being separate. So from that point of view, we're all these dream characters. We're all dream characters in each other's dreams. Because when you have a dream at night and you wake up, and what does that dream mean? How would I interpret it? What's the symbolism? And you begin to realize, all the figures in the dream were my dream characters. They were embodied, reflective aspects of parts of me. And that's what I'm talking about. So one of the ways that Wetiko works, or that it operates, covertly, operates, is through our reactions. We'll see somebody, that person has Wetiko. And then, like I said, if we actually hold that viewpoint of solidifying them in that way, then we've fallen under the spell because we're thinking they're separate. But then if we react, well, great, you're having a reaction. What about if you self-reflect and look at what that's showing you? You've just dispelled Wetiko if you do that. But if you actually become identified with your reaction and act it out, well, then you become the vector to incarnate Wetiko into our world. Now, this other way that Wetiko plays itself out and empowers itself is through turning away from seeing it. There are so many people who are like, I don't want to think about evil. Or if something's really, it brings up pain, or something's really dark. Oh no, I'm all about love and light and harmony and compassion, and I just want to stay with that. Well, I want to point out that if you have that viewpoint, you're unwittingly feeding Wetiko, because Wetiko is getting fed off of you being in avoidance of looking at that dark. Now, Jung himself has a famous quote. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it. He says, and I'm paraphrasing, the way to become enlightened is not like by imagining kind of angels of light, but by making the darkness conscious, by bringing light to the darkness. That light, you realize, has no value whatsoever unless it illumines the dark. Okay? And I point out in my new book, like in the Kabbalah, for example, and the Kabbalah is totally, just so speaking about Wetiko in its own way, but that you'll have to wait for my new book. And it's pointing out that the true light, that it comes out of the dark. It comes out of evil. Okay? And so if we have an avoidance of coming to terms with evil when it comes our way, and if we look away and turn a blind eye. If you remember, I was saying that Wetiko is a form of blindness. Well, if we turn a blind eye to Wetiko, well, then we're feeding it by doing that. But if we become overly fascinated by it, by that evil, well, then we're feeding it too. But there's a third way, and I point this out in the book, that instead of just turning a blind eye or becoming like overly fascinated by it, you can actually see it. You can actually, oh, wow, now I see how it operates, and I realize that if I fall into my unconscious and act out my unconscious, I can act it out at any moment. So you're actually seeing how it operates through your own unconscious and through your blind spots, and how it's operating through the field. And whenever like that, we're bringing in light, you're, concurrently, reciprocally, will get consolated the dark, which is actually an expression of the light instead of opposing to it, and that's a whole other thing. That's in my new book too. But the point is that once you see it, so you're not turning a blind eye, you're not being overly fascinated by it, you can see it and go, oh, I'm a sovereign being, I see you. As a sovereign being, I can choose where I place my attention, and now I want to place my attention on creating the world I want to live in. That empowers us, and that has a positive influence on the world, and then Wetiko just withers away, because it feeds off of our attention and or our unconsciousness. Okay? And so that's why it can't stand. When we see it, just like in a vampire, when the light of day comes, it can't operate. It can only operate in the shadows, when it's unseen. And so that's kind of why. So I'll just give you an example. Like I have a lot of dreams, and one dream, it was right the morning where two of my teachers, these great Tibetan lamas, were coming. So I think I was really charged up. And the dream was me and a bunch of friends. We were trying to find. There was a vampire, and we were like trying to find him, on the lookout for him. And we were all chanting, Bela Lugosi, Bela Lugosi, Bela Lugosi. And then I saw him, and I tried to point him out to everybody else, and no one else could see him. And that dream was like probably over 20 years ago. And I think my sense is that I've gained a fluency now with my work, and as my work gets out all over the place, that I'm like, I think, or at least it's fun for me to imagine, that I think I'm more and more gaining skill at trying to transmit what I'm seeing, and in a way that's helping other people to see it, because keep in mind, the source of Wetiko is in us. If we think, oh, we need to like get a different president or government or this or that, yeah, that might help or not. I mean, who knows? But it's just, sort of, that's not really going to do in the long run much difference from a certain point of view, in the sense that any of us, when we really find that root in ourselves of Wetiko, and the thing about Wetiko, it's totally related to addiction, to trauma. Because think about, for example, like trauma, just as an example. You become traumatized historically pretty much like one moment in time, and so what happens? The wholeness of your psyche splits off, and you develop, well, it's interesting, you develop this dissociated, split off part of your psyche. In psychology, they call this an autonomous complex. The ancients call those demons, by the way.
What?
The ancients call autonomous complexes, that's what they refer to as a demon. Okay, those are equivalent terms. And but say you become traumatized, you split off, you develop this autonomous complex, this demon. But what actually happens, so then your reaction to being traumatized, to try to heal your trauma, is the very thing that creates the trauma you're trying to heal from, in an infinitely self-perpetuating feedback loop. Mm-hmm. That's what trauma is. I mean, think about what's the symptom of trauma. It's the repetition compulsion. It's the compulsion to repeat something, but the very thing you're repeating, and you're actually trying to complete a process to discharge something. But if we're in trauma, the way we do it actually is creating the very thing we're trying to heal from, which is a form of madness. Mm-hmm. And yet, encoded in that repetition compulsion, in that traumatic response, is its own solution. is its own medicine, because something's trying to unlock. You know, one beautiful, my favorite definition of trauma is unexperienced experience. Right? When the moment of trauma happened, we couldn't, it was overwhelming, we couldn't integrate it into our ego, and so we developed symptoms. But it's continually like reiterating itself. Compulsively, we're, you know, just recreating it so that we actually are able to experience what we weren't able to experience consciously. And, you know, and then over time, or maybe in one moment, that liberates the trauma. Well, how come I bring that up? Because the thing about Wetiko, it's at the it is trauma, it is informing addiction, but it's also similar or helpful to have the recognition. Oh yeah, we're actually. I mean, just consider this: we are destroying the planet. We're destroying the biosphere. Anybody who doesn't see that is just, you know, they're being blind. I mean, it's not like, you know, that hard of a thing to show. And but then the question is, well, how come we're doing that? How come we as a species are actually participating in our own collective suicide? It's an interesting question. How come we're doing that? And I would point out from what Wetiko is showing us, what quantum physics is showing us, is that, we're doing that as the very vehicle to learn how to not do it, which we clearly haven't learned, or we wouldn't be doing it. That's just like trauma. We're like traumatized because we haven't learned how to actually become free of the trauma, you know. And getting back to the demon thing, autonomous complexes or demons, you know, ancient people would call them demons, is when you think, like I do Tibetan Buddhist practice, and the idea of demons, all the teachings are saying that ultimately, on one level, you need to relate to them like they're separate, and you need to honor them in the sense of being in relationship to them as if they're actually existing. But ultimately speaking, they're just the reflection of your own mind. They're just your own energy. And when you have that realization, that's when you wake up. And so what I've done with the Wetiko book is, just as a modern person from the West who, based on my own trauma of having a real psychopathic father and then almost being incredibly destroyed by psychiatry, I mean, I just want to give a little, let me see, do we have 10 hours? Okay. It was unbelievable.
Sure agree.
What I quickly figured out in psychiatry was, if I were to actually just express my experience, just like when people would say, how are you, what's going on? And I would say, this is what I'm experiencing. That would confirm to them, my insanity. So I quickly figured out, I better not say anything. And I since have become friends over the years with a bunch of psychiatrists, and there was one of whom, from Harvard, who we became friends, and he told me, he goes, let me remember this, his definition of sanity is to know who to tell what when. He was really switched on to that. His profession was insane. So, because in psychiatry, once they label you as, at that point I was supposedly chemically imbalanced, anything I did, they would see through that lens, and then once they locked me up and gave me medication, which just aborted the healthy, because, when you have a spiritual awakening, it's almost always, if not always, precipitated. It has healthy aspects and pathological aspects, and there was a pathological aspect. I was abused by a psychopathic father. But by them not recognizing the spiritual awakening and basically shutting that down, it made me sicker and sicker. And then the more sick I got, the more that confirmed to them their viewpoint is being correct. He really is sick. And I'm thinking, my God, they're casting a spell. They're creating a spell. They have no idea. I mean, it's exactly Wetiko. Because if you think about how I was describing Wetiko, it's like thinking that what you're perceiving out there is separate from you, is objective, and that you're not having anything, you're not participating at all in what's happening. You see, so that's one way of understanding where quantum physics fits in, is that, oh my God, we actually aren't just these passive observers, but we're participating in the evocation and the creation of our experience. And when you realize that, I can talk from my own experience, it unlocks the most enormous creativity, which we're using 24/7 anyway, but most of us are using it to imagine, oh, I don't have an imagination, oh, I'm not creative. And then you're so creative that you dream up all the evidence to prove that you're not creative. Not realizing that that's, I mean, I'll just give you an example. Like in Tibetan Buddhism, there's a hidden treasure. There's a tradition called the Hidden Treasures. It's a lineage I do practice to, and they're very interesting things. So this great, the great guru or enlightened being who founded and started Tibetan Buddhism, who is an actual historical person, he was the one who created the treasure tradition. And what it is, and this is mind-blowing, and this isn't fairy tales. I mean, scholars study this stuff, and actually there's an article I wrote about it that I think is on my website, but what the hidden treasure, so he would plant in the universe, this enlightened being, the sacred teachings or sacred objects that had blessings in them. And he would plant them in the earth, in the water, in the sky, in disciples' minds. And then he would inspire, centuries later, the person who is destined to discover that hidden treasure at exactly the moment it was needed, to bring the people back in balance, almost like it was a multivitamin or something. And they've gotten, think about the unconscious. It compensates, the unconscious compensates on one-sidedness. So all of a sudden, right at the moment when everybody was, say materialistic or, whatever the one-sidedness was, then somebody who was fated to discover the particular treasure, sometimes they would even see a syllable in a book, and that syllable would open up their mind, and they would have 20 volumes of sacred teachings coming through, and they would just transcribe it, just from seeing that one syllable. That's very interesting. In other words, at any moment, any of us could hear somebody say a word or hear a song on the radio or something, and I'm sure we've all had that experience. All of a sudden, we just remember something. That's like a hidden treasure that was hidden inside of our unconscious that all of a sudden comes out. Now, the thing with these hidden treasures, well, first off, in the quantum physics book, I point out that quantum physics is, from my point of view, a hidden treasure. I have no authorization to there are certain enlightened people, which I'm not, but they have the authorization to say, oh, that's a hidden treasure. I don't have that authorization at all. But what I do have is I've studied this treasure tradition, and I've studied quantum physics, and I'm like, oh my God, we as a species have dreamed up quantum physics through the medium of science to unlock our creative genius, to heal Wetiko. And that's, in a sense, what the quantum physics book is about. So the whole thing is really, really interesting because it's all based on that we're collectively dreaming. But we're all collectively, this is something that we're doing mostly unconsciously. And because we're doing it unconsciously, then the dream manifests destructively, in which we're killing ourselves. What I'm pointing out is just let's add light to what's actually happening. I mean, what a radical idea, And by becoming conscious of what we're actually doing, and we're doing it anyway, but we're doing it unconsciously. Once we actually become awake to our incredible creative power, because I think I was about to say that the real gift of quantum physics, which is the thing that heals Wetiko, is unlocking our creative nature. We have, each one of us has incredible, unimaginable creative energy at our disposal. But like I was saying, we're imagining that, we're not creative. And then we draw the evidence to prove to ourselves. So, okay, I was going to tie one more dot, and that is, in Tibetan Buddhism, there's a hidden treasure. Like the Tibetan Book of the Dead is a hidden treasure. It was written by Padmasambhava, hidden centuries later, somebody discovered it. That's an example of a hidden treasure, right? And I was saying, this isn't fairy tale. Scholars really, study this. And so there's a hidden treasure in Tibetan Buddhism, not the Tibetan Book of the Dead, this other one, in which there's a teaching, and I've essentialized the teaching into 4 words. And the words are, and I really want people to hear this, as viewed, so appears. Okay, so in the treasure text, it actually says, as a thing is viewed, that's the way it appears. But just essentialize it, as viewed, so appears. And think about it. Think about if you're in a dream. You view the ink blot of a dream in a certain way, the dream instantaneously, not over 1 second or 2 seconds, in 0 time. The very way you're projecting onto the ink blot gives you all the evidence you need that that's objectively true. And if you don't see that deeper process, you become entranced, thinking, oh, that's really out there, separate from the objective, and then I'm the subject, and then you've fallen under the spell, and you've given yourself away. As viewed, so appears is so profound that, I'll just give you an example. If somebody hears that teaching and they say, oh, I think as viewed, so appears is BS, it's not true. Well, the whole universe will then shapeshift and give them all the evidence that as viewed, so appears is not true. Which from their point of view is proving, the accuracy of their viewpoint. But from my point of view is like, no, that's the profundity of as viewed, so appears. So, we all have an edge around, and in a couple of minutes, I'm going to open it up for questions. I think a lot of us have an edge. It's just like this natural thing to talk about or to think about evil or dark and all that, And, but it can be so helpful when you contemplate it in a certain way, and when you really shed light on, what is the nature of evil, of the evil that's playing out in the world, in myself, And, of course, individually, any of us doing shadow work can be incredibly helpful. And, but the idea that we're not just dealing with the personal shadow. In Wetiko, we're dealing with the archetypal shadow, with really the dark side of the divine. But what all the wisdom traditions are saying is that encoded, hidden within that darkness is the true light, similar to how encoded within Wetiko, the evil of Wetiko that's informing us destroying ourselves, it's actually helping us to wake up. And everything, how it's going to work out depends on if we recognize what it's showing us. So thank you. So that's my little talk for tonight. And I'm happy to open it up for questions. Yeah.
Hello, I don't know if you remember me. We had a conversation in your home once. John Hurst introduced us.
Who introduced us?
John Hurst.
Oh, okay, right. Totally.
So
You're the one who's into words and language and all that. I remember.
Yeah, and I recently got a tagline for my word magic work, which is wordplay that unravels mass hypnosis and elevates the frequency of consciousness. Because what I've seen is that the language itself, we are casting the spell upon ourselves.
Totally.
And that we can collectively upgrade language. Because it's software. So I just, in terms of our universal creative power, we are all familiar with omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent, all qualities of something far vaster than ourselves, but the one word that pertains to ourselves as well is virtually unknown, and that word is omnificent, and it means possessing full creative power. And when people argue and say, oh, but I'm not creative, I respond that we have as a species already demonstrated that we possess full destructive power. So the opposite has to be true.
Right, totally. I so appreciate you saying that. There's such a fine line between being destructive and being constructive or creative. And I would even say that if we're not, channeling our creative energy in a constructive way, it turns destructive.
Yes.
And I so appreciate too the thing with words and with language, because Wetiko, it's a semantic syndrome. It has to do with how we place meaning, but also the power of the word. The power of our words are incredibly powerful. I mean, well, how do you make a word? You spell it, right? So words are like casting spells. And, and I see this again and again. For example, like I have all these groups. I have like a whole community in Portland that's formed around my work. And so an example being somebody might say, oh, well, spiritual awakening is really hard. And, if I'm awake in that moment, I'll be like, well, I'm just having a hallucination right now that you just put yourself under a spell. Because out of like, quantum physics says, oh yeah, there's all the potential worlds are right there in potentiality. And then when we, observe or, we dream up out of the potentiality, whatever the universe is, the infinite wave function collapses into the actual one that does manifest. But if that person is saying, oh, spiritual awakening is hard, out of all the universes, they've then invoked a universe that's going to give them evidence that's going to confirm their viewpoint. That's a perfect example,
Well, and I do a translation of the language, of the English language, and I spell it Trance, with the idea that the words are casting spells.
Yeah, totally.
And just to complete, so others can have a turn, of course, the idea that this is a dream, and it's so interesting that one of the first nursery rhymes we learn is that life is but a dream.
Right.
And if you look at, we have the phrase life stream and the phrase life dream, and you can't hear a difference because there isn't one.
Right. Wow, thank you. Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. You said you have friends who are in psychiatry, and I just wanted to understand like how you partner with them in that, because I'm actually a psych NP, and I have chosen to take a break from the profession because what I found is that it's a top-down hierarchical model I'm putting my power into a med. I'm making the person feel this way because of that specific medication.
Right.
And then we're going to get you back on track, right, with like how everybody else is thinking, and we're going to get you back in the box. So how and so how is it that you have these conversations with people? Because I'm still like I struggle with this, right? Because do I go back into the profession and then I help people and like start pulling different meds and then they eventually be able to empower themselves, or do we have to start something completely new? Because do you see what I'm saying?
Totally.
Because I struggle with that, because there are so many people who take meds that are really placebos. They are, and then they cause these disastrous health effects.
Right.
And then so we're operating in tertiary prevention mode when really which is, if you think of working upstream, so you have secondary and then primary prevention, you stop a problem before it starts, right? But how do we get to that point? Because we're in like devastating like cleanup mode right now.
Yeah, totally.
So how do we work ourselves back up? Do you see what I'm saying?
No, I do. And it's unfortunate because a couple of my really close friends who were psychiatrists, they were world famous psychiatrists, and they've passed. And one of my best friends is a psychiatrist, a psychiatric nurse, who we talk all the time, and she incredibly struggles around this type of thing, because the system, the understanding I have is that the system itself is so, it's just broken, and it's based on, so for example, for me, there was an illness in my family. My father was a really sick guy, but he was very bright and charismatic, so it wasn't recognized. So then, being sensitive, I felt it and I began suffering, so then I began being seen as the identified patient by my family and by all of psychiatry. And then once I began being seen that way and being medicated and locked up, and I got sick, and that confirmed to them what he really is. So, that was the tragedy of my family, in that my parents both died, and convinced that I was, sick, and I've had to live with that. So there's, in a way, because sometimes I even think, two things. I think about, God, I want to become more of a psychiatric activist, because I'm so, to say angry is a euphemism around, it's a true statement that psychiatry destroyed my family. I haven't had a family for like close to 20 years. And I have a huge soul family and a lot of friends, so, it's all good that way. But then also the idea that sometimes I want to just write books around, pointing out, because I was in a privileged position. I'm not just an academic sitting in my white tower studying it. No, I was like locked up and restrained and injected and diagnosed and pathologized. I mean, from the psychiatric point of view, they wanted me to subscribe, to agree to their diagnosis, that I had a lifelong mental illness and that I needed to be on medication until my dying breath. And if I would have agreed to that, in their mind, that would have been a successful treatment. Now, what's wrong with that picture?
Wow. I've worked in inpatient and outpatient settings, so I understand this. And the whole thing, the whole reason I'm going to let you out is if you know how to keep yourself safe, and you can understand how to keep the people around you safe. And if somebody couldn't do that, then I couldn't let you out legally. So I love what you say is knowing what to say to whom.
Yeah.
Because if somebody can't tell the difference, then I don't know how you're going to be able to do that in other scenarios.
Right, exactly.
But see, here's the thing is that the whole world now feels so unsafe. There are so many, there's such a lack of safe spaces in the world that so many people are running around with this psychosis that there are no safe places.
Right.
And so and I guess the way that I've chosen to handle it is I do staff education in the clinic where I am, specifically because a lot of these clinicians also feel like they're crazy. And so what we do is we work through helping them understand their emotions, being the observer of their emotions, which is the physical manifestation, right? The feeling, which is the intellectualization of that emotion, and then being able to distinguish between them. And so by you're talking about the reaction, right? You're taking a step back and being able to observe, I'm the observer of these things.
Right.
Then I don't feed back into the programming, right?
Right, exactly.
And I feel like by helping the clinicians do that, then we're again going to a more primary prevention, because if I'm working with somebody who's very sick in a family model, that's helping one family, but if we go to the clinicians and they see 50 patients a week, then we're going to be able to do it more collectively. But I just you know, I want to help. And I'm like blown away by what you're saying. You know, just it's inspiring for me to meet people in the mental health system, you know, who actually have consciousness. You know, because it's so. It's true. It's true. I'm just being authentic. You know, and one thought that comes up that might not. It's not just having to do with psychiatry. But like so many of us can feel crazy, right? I mean, think about it. We're in a world gone mad. And I mean, who here hasn't felt crazy at a certain point, right? And well, what I point out, and this really helps to recontextualize that experience, is when you actually have the recognition, oh yeah, we're interfacing with the whole field, we're interconnected with the whole field, we're actually these antennae that are picking up whatever energies, if they're shadow or madness or whatever, we're actually picking that up. So all of a sudden, because it's so easy when you feel, you know, crazy or upset or whatever, to personalize it and pathologize yourself. And that's then you being complicit in creating, you know, your own illness. But when you actually see, oh, wait a second, I'm feeling this shadow, this crazy part, and wait, maybe I'm a shaman who's actually like a shaman. When they work with somebody, they literally get sick. They take on the sickness, but they have the strength. You see, and how I understood this, I'm not in any way saying I'm a shaman, only in my wildest dreams am I a shaman, but the idea of the shaman is they get called, you know, then nobody in their right mind would ever choose to be a shaman. You know, you'd have to be crazy, and but you get called into the underworld, the place of demons and death and insanity and all that. And you know, and if you're able to come back and bring the gift from the experience, but the idea of the shaman, they will literally take on they'll get sick. They'll take on the illness of the person that they're working with, or the community, or the world. And so in a sense, we are all shamans in training who have gotten sick based on the sickness that pervades the whole field. And to the extent we can metabolize that, we then actually, in a non-local way, are contributing healing to the whole field. You had a question? Yeah.
Yeah, trying to summarize everything that you're saying, when someone identifies with something outside of themselves, which creates a duality and a separation, that's a psychosis. When someone fully understands the truth of who they are, they're awake. And they're beyond the psychosis. And so the simple truth is the journey within to discover who you really are, absent the story and the conditions of the cultures and the societies and the rest of the nonsense.
So is there a question there?
Well, is this kind of the antidote for the Matrix?
Matrix.
Yeah, in the sense that, like I was saying, that Wetiko, ME disease, me disease, it's a misidentification of who we think we are, you know, and so we've given ourselves away and we've identified with who we're not, and to the extent, you know, if we're in that state, we're then like hanging out with other people in that state, we're all reinforcing each other's insanity, and we're thinking from that state we're going to actually be able to like create peace. No, we're like, you know, it's like the darkness creates just more darkness. So yeah, you're absolutely correct. The idea that any of us, when we actually remember, which is an interesting term to remember, because in alchemy, you know, which is such an amazing thing when you realize it's symbolically representing, like Jung says, the individuation process, that one of the major stages in alchemy is like dismemberment, where all your parts get like dismembered and cooked and smelted so as to have a higher integration, and that's the remembering, and that's the remembering who we are. And it's not that hard to do that, but what can be a little bit challenging is then not falling asleep again. Just like in a dream, you can have lucidity, but it's very easy to just get absorbed back in the dream. So the idea of spiritual practice, the way I understand it, is to remember and to remember to remember, and to have that be your practice and to stabilize. And then everything that happens in your day, you know, actually is stimulating your lucidity, is a lucidity stimulator. You know? Yeah, I don't know. So did you...
What is a comment on that is that it's very simple to teach the inner intelligence of the self how to find itself. It's a process called reminding. And because the inner intelligence of the self is found, it's not lost, and it understands the difference between the unity and the singularity and the duality, then it's simply about getting in touch with the inner self that knows and releasing everything else. And this can happen in minutes to hours. You already are everything you hope to be. You just have to release everything else that's illusion.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
I was just going to ask, how is it that this Wetiko, or whatever you're calling it, destroys us? What is the mechanism of destruction?
We see the thing about, okay, that's a great question, and because there are so many things that I didn't get to tonight, you know, because we only had like an hour, but in the apocryphal texts, the texts that aren't part of the canon of the Bible, they talk about a counterfeiting spirit, and they have a whole Greek name for it. I won't go into that, but it translates as the counterfeiting spirit. That's Wetiko. So what Wetiko does, it apes us. And then, you know, I mean, they even talk about that Satan is the ape of the Lord, right? So Wetiko impersonates us. It will be this mimic. It will mime us. So it will assume our form. It will put us on. And put us on means two things. Putting us on means fooling ourselves, and putting us on means putting us on like a suit of clothes. And if we're not awake in that moment of that false version of ourselves, we then identify with it and then act out thinking we're acting out ourselves when we're actually like this marionette on a string, you know? And by doing that, you know, we're coming from this deluded place because we're not in touch with who we actually are. And, you know, so, and we act out in a way
that becomes like a feedback loop that feeds the very darkness that's at the root of that process. So when you amplify that process, that results in, whether it's a person, they'll suicide. Whether it's a species, they'll destroy the life support system of the species, the biosphere, and have collective suicide. The point is that when we're not consciously engaged with our own genius, our own creativity, like, we were saying before, there's a really fine line between being creatively constructive and destructive. And so if we're not channeling that creative energy constructively, it's sort of like it turns against us and destroys us. And so did that answer your question?
Yes. Could I ask if this is an example of what you're talking about? I have observed people, usually if it's just one person in the room or a small group, and things seem to be going on very nicely. Everybody's getting along and talking and communicating, and then all of a sudden something triggers one person who suddenly shifts, goes into a rage of anger, paces, says ridiculous things that don't make any sense, and repeat and repeat and repeat. Is that an example of what you're talking about?
Yeah, definitely. It's really interesting because I have, like I said, I have a whole community that has formed around my work in Portland, and I have all of these groups, right? And so what that brings up is like, and we have this intention, we're going to transduce light, we're going to awaken in the dream, right? And you can guarantee when you have that intention, you're going to invite a guest, and the guest is the shadow or the unconscious. And the unconscious, it will act itself out through the person who at that moment is most susceptible, to whatever, maybe something's happening and they're, it's touching a wound or a trauma, and, and they don't have that spaciousness just to like have the meta-awareness and to disidentify from that. But immediately whatever gets triggered in them and they just like act it out. And so the thing about Wetiko, it's not just an abstract term. In any family system, in any relationship, I mean, it's amazing to watch how, it's almost like we can draw a map around how it operates, And so that's an example.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I want people who haven't asked questions yet, so...
Anybody else? Can I actually ask a follow-up question to that? So let's just say that you're having a meeting where you want to, serve the highest and best good. So are you inviting Wetiko then into that space?
Yeah. Right.
Could you explain that just a little? Yeah,
totally.
Okay.
No, I appreciate that needs clarification. And the answer is yes. If we come together and we're going to we're having the intention to wake up and bring light into the world, it makes me think, for example, there's a couple things that it makes me think of. One is when I got out of that last hospital in '82, and I was in deep pain from the trauma from my father and then the trauma of psychiatry. The two were like a 1-2 punch that literally almost killed me. And so then I met my teachers. I was living in New York. They were right there. I would see them all the time, these lamas, right? And I would, every time I would just tell them how much pain I was in, and I would describe, the demons and the darkness. And one time they said to me, they go, Paul, it's because you have such potential for light that the demons are even interested.
Oh, wow.
If you didn't have that potential for light, they would bother someone else, And so, and that was really interesting to me because what I've learned in my own process, and I'm continually deepening my understanding and, and all that, and I see, oh wow, I'm getting really, now my work is getting out all over the world, it's really helping people, I'm more and more stepping into my light, right, stepping into myself. And what I've seen, what I've experienced is that the more I do that, the more these darker forces in my own mind and in the world get consolated. And in the past, I would interpret that oh wow, that's a expression of how screwed up I am, clearly. But now I understand, no, that's an expression that I'm on the right path. That's an indication that I'm really, so, and that reframe I think is really, really true. you know? So the idea is that when we come together, like we are now, to like transduce light, you know, I mean, if we had enough time and, you know, we were more like interacting with each other at a certain point, it would become obvious, oh yeah, there's like some, you know, darker stuff that we're all dreaming up to play out through whoever, you know? But the point is, instead of making it a bad thing, instead of, oh, that's an obstacle to like what we want to do, which is to wake up, no, that's the doorway. That's the very thing that we need to like look at and to like own and to realize we're dreaming that up, and you know, that's not an accident that it's happening. And by having that viewpoint, that higher viewpoint, then that actually creates the circumstance where that darkness will, you know, whatever, catalyze light.
So then do you go into the darkness? That's what I guess I'm understanding the path, right?
Right.
So you're transducing light, which then creates the contrast of the dark.
Right.
Right? And like Jung said, to do the shadow work, go there and to understand it, and then, you know, and then...
Right.
But
no, I get it. So you're saying
like you're walking along the crevasse, right?
Yeah,
like,
totally.
So
right, and what comes up for me when you ask that, because that's the perfect next question. In alchemy, they talk about the hermetic vessel, the container. And so in the groups that I have, for example, they're containers. They're like, you know, alchemical containers. I mean, there are people, you know, it's every week, you know, 3 groups a week, and then once a month, a group for the community. And there are people in the groups over 20 years. There are some groups, the average tenure of the group might be 10 years, each person. That creates a container. So that when the darkness comes up, because I just want to conjure up the image of the alchemical container. So think, here's this like, you know, container, the hermetic vessel, like a test tube. And in it, in the hermetic vessel, is what's called in alchemy the prima materia, the raw, the chaos, the shit, the dark, right? That's the prima materia. Underneath the hermetic vessel is the fire of awareness. If there's no fire, nothing transforms. And there has to be pressure from that fire, because the test tube is sealed. And if there's too much pressure, what happens? It blows its lid, and then you're back at square one. So, but there has to be enough pressure, it has to be able to be contained, and then the prima materia, which is like this demon, like a dragon, actually transforms into the philosopher's stone, into the gold, into the lapis, which is the awakened state. You know, so I think that would be a perfect image. That, you know, do you as a person, if you're dealing with this darkness in a relationship person, you know, do you have the container in yourself to like inquire into with that person, or in yourself with the darkness that's getting activated? If it's a family system, if it's a group, does that group have the container to like actually explore? Because it can get really, you know, my groups are an example. They can get incredibly intense and really explosive, you know? And instead of like, oh no, we can't have conflict here, well, why not? That's, you know, when, you know, if there's friction, what does friction do? It creates light. You know, so what if we actually, instead of, oh, we're a spiritual group and we can't have any darkness and any conflict, no, we're all about love and harmony, that's an expression of how inwardly polarized we are against our own darkness. But when there's darkness, when there's like conflict, what about if you like go into that with the awareness that we're just playing roles, okay? And so that's that's a little bit of it. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, it totally does, because when somebody presents something that's a bit esoteric, I also feel like we need to have a practical application for it.
Oh, totally.
And so, for instance, Greg does inner child workshops, and 4 of us here went and did one. And Denny creates a safe space in which to do that alchemy, and he specifically calls it alchemy. And so it's doing that shadow work in a contained. He says when you're ready to come out of the oven, like that's when we can do it. So
totally.
You're talking about turning up the heat. So that's why I wanted to just make sure I understand the application for it. And
totally. And the thing which is really just one final piece about it. So here, I was trying for decades to heal like the Wetiko in my family, and the more I tried, the worse it got, and I mean, it was a nightmare. I mean, it was really intense, but it was showing me something. So then, what happened? I literally created like this recreation of my family in these groups, because they're not just like students of mine. We all become like really good friends, and so that I just wanted to point that out. That's really, really interesting. That the family just got destroyed, but then I like unconsciously dreamed up my own family. And the other part of it is that oftentimes I get dreamed up in the role of the father, being the authority figure, being the leader, and I get to play the role of the positive father in a way that I wanted my father to play, but he never was able to. And there's something really healing about that. Yeah. So thank you.
So thank you. I think it's time for
Yeah.